Okay, before we go on to see how neurons can be connected up into networks and circuits and to achieve computation, let's do a quick review. This is how neurons are going to communicate. First, you see here you got the presynaptic terminal. You have a postsynaptic dendritic spine. So what we know so far, an action potential is going to come down here. Transmitters will be released. Receptor channels opened up, ions in, and the target cell will respond. Either it'll be excited or it'll be inhibited. So let's take a look at the animation. So the flow of information is going this way. And again, neurons work with a combination of electricity and chemistry. So here we see the cell body is generating the action potential, goes down the axon. Remember, that's a domino effect of gates opening. Here comes the action potential. Sodium is rushing in here, depolarizing the terminal. That's going to cause these voltage-gated calcium channels to open up. Calcium will move into the terminal, down its concentration gradient. And then a series of interactions with proteins happens. And then these vesicles here, which are filled with transmitter, they're going to move towards the terminal membrane. There they go. These neurotransmitters will be released into the synaptic gap. And here you see some of these green things here would be ions that are hanging out in the external fluid. The transmitters, when they bind to these protein receptor channels, the channels open up, and depending on what the transmitter is and the receptor, either positively charged ions go into the spine or negatively charged ions. Because an action potential, you see this electrical signal, was generated, we can infer those were positively charged ions. The transmitters then have to be deactivated or removed from the synapse, or else they would continue to stimulate the target cell. Alright, so now we're going to start to think about how neurons can be hooked up into nervous systems that do useful things. Let's imagine, for illustration purposes, a little frog and a very, very simple nervous system that this frog has. It has a sensory neuron, labeled A here. That sensory neuron has dendrites, you might say, but there are a lot of specializations for sensory neurons, so they don't look like necessarily the branching tree dendritic situation you've seen before. But let's say this sensory neuron can detect some patch of light, or it could be the opposite of light, shadow. So it's responsive to light. All right. Now this sensory neuron detects light, and if it detects light or the shadow, it will generate action potentials, send it down the axon. And let's say the sensory neuron synapse is on a motor neuron, labeled C. And this motor neuron generates prey capture behavior. So the frog opens its mouth, tongue comes out, and it's going to try to capture a little bug. So we can think of this sensory neuron as sort of like a bug detector, right? A little shadow moving across the visual field might well be a bug. And so when the sensory neuron detects that, it activates the motor response and you get prey capture. Now if you think about this nervous system then, composed of two neurons here, there's no conditionality in this system. In other words, if that little shadow moves across the visual scene and this sensory neuron detects it, then it's going to activate the motor neuron and the frog will capture its food. So this frog will always respond to a bug. If it's hungry, it'll respond to the bug. But even if it's full, it will respond to the bug. Now you can imagine that that might not be useful sometimes. So for example, you have to keep in mind that every time a frog makes a move to catch prey, it itself becomes more visible. The act of moving and so on can maybe make it more visible to its predators. So prey capture here carries a cost. The frog is in a natural environment with its own predators. So you can imagine then there are natural selection might favor a more sophisticated nervous system so that the frog only generates prey capture when it's hungry. Or, in addition, when it's hungry and maybe it's a safe environment, right? So it doesn't make sense to waste energy trying to eat bugs if you're already full. And if you're in a dangerous environment, it might make sense to not engage in prey capture if predators are nearby watching. Then they will more easily see you. So the idea is, over evolutionary time, more sophisticated nervous systems were favored. Here we can add a couple of simple elements and see how the system now generates conditional behavior. So here we got still sensory neuron A detecting bugs, little patches of light and dark or whatnot moving across a visual scene. We got the motor neuron going to generate the prey capture. But now we got two new neurons, another sensory neuron, and this one we can imagine perhaps it represents the fullness of the stomach. So if the stomach is full, then this sensory neuron would send action potentials to activate an interneuron, X here. Now imagine this interneuron is inhibitory on the motor neuron. So in other words, it would release transmitters that open up channels that let chloride ions in. That's going to inhibit the target cell. So in this case then, if the frog is full, even if it sees a bug, sensory neuron A wants to activate motor neuron C, but if the frog is full, sensory neuron B is going to activate interneuron X and block activity of the motor neuron. So in this case now, the frog does not generate prey capture when its belly is full. Likewise, maybe sensory neuron B is detecting maybe the sound of a predator. Right, so this could be a sensory neuron in its auditory pathway as opposed to hooked up to its stomach. So if there's a predator nearby, even though it might be hungry and it sees a bug, the activation of sensory neuron B would prevent prey capture. So in other words, as soon as you start to build more neurons into your nervous system, especially some of these interneurons that are linking these different sensory neurons, you get more complex behavior. It's more conditional behavior. So the evolution of interneurons and just brains in general is in large part a story about how these nervous systems are generating more complex behavior that is conditional on the particular environmental circumstances. All right, let's take another example from the case of humans. You probably are familiar with doctors. Sometimes when they examine patients, they will shine a little light in the eyes. So they're checking for a pupil response. Are the pupils responsive? And they want to know this because if the pupils are not responding normally, that may be an indication of some trauma to the brain, certain parts of the brain. So this is a diagram of some of the key neurons involved. Here we got the eyes over here. The green one is the optic nerve, so of course light will be detected by the retina and electrical signals sent down the axons of the optic nerve. Now, most of the optic nerve makes a relay in a structure called LGN, lateral geniculate nucleus, and then up to the visual cortex. But we're going to focus on this other small little nerve tract that goes to an area of the midbrain and makes a synapse here in cells in the midbrain. Now notice these blue cells are kind of like interneurons, and so they're going to make connections to these red cells, which are motor neurons. Now these motor neurons send axons back out to the iris, and when these motor neurons are active, sending action potentials down here, the iris will constrict, and so you'll get what we would call a pupillary response. So the pupils constrict. But the pupil is just the opening, so it's really the iris is constricting. Right? So we've got three neurons in the system. You got sensory neurons, the neurons in the optic nerve that are carrying information about light. So when you shine light into this eye, action potentials will race down here to the blue interneuron. Interneuron activates the motor neuron, notice on both sides here, and so activity in the motor neurons are going to constrict the pupils. Okay, so notice, even if you shine light in just one eye, because of the branching of the interneuron, both motor neurons will be active and you'll get pupillary restriction in both eyes. So that's a normal response. Now, the optic nerve on the other eye over here is just not shown, but the reverse would be true as well. Okay, so now we can take a look at what might happen if some of these pathways are damaged. And we'll consider three pathways here. And this will help us understand why doctors shine the lights in our eyes, and because then they can make inferences about damage to these pathways. So let's say that there's damage to the optic nerve for the left eye. So if you think this person, we're looking down at them, so here's the left eye, optic nerve is damaged. If then you shine light in the left eye, right? So here's the optic nerve, the light information will not get to the interneuron here because this pathway is damaged. And if that's the case, then neither of the motor neurons will be activated. So there will be no constriction of the pupils in this person when you shine in the left eye. So the pupils will be unresponsive, right? But look, if the damage is here and you shine light in the right eye, although it's not shown here, the optic nerve will be intact, right? So you'll get that pathway going over to the blue interneuron, the one would be up here, and then that's going to activate both of the motor neurons, and you'll get a response in the pupils. Pupils will constrict. So if you get response, normal response in the left eye, but no response in the right eye, you can infer that the damage is in the optic nerve pathway to the midbrain. On the other hand, let's suppose the damage is to the motor neuron here for the left eye. Let's see what the pattern of responses would be. Shine light here. Well, light information goes down here to the interneuron. Interneuron's going to activate both motor neurons, but this one is damaged, so you won't get a pupil response in the left eye, but you will get a pupil response in the right eye because this motor neuron is intact. So if damage is at location 2 and you shine light here, you're not going to get a response in that eye that you're shining in, but you will get a pupil response in the other eye. If we shine the light here, since this one is, remember we're talking about damage to location 2, if you shine the light here, you'll get a normal response in this one, but you won't get a response in this one. Again, so you can infer that it's a problem in the motor neuron pathway. Let's finally take a look if it's damage at location 3. Well, then it's sort of going to be the reverse, because that's the other motor neuron going to the right eye. So again here, if you shine light in the right eye here, you're not going to get a pupillary response because the motor neuron is damaged. Neither will you get a response in this eye if you shine light in the left eye. So in summary then, doctors shine the little lights in our eyes to make inferences about some of these pathways. And so if there is an abnormal response to the pupils, then we can infer that there's some damage at the level of the midbrain or the pathways, the sensory pathways or motor pathways coming from the midbrain.